Hello everyone, and welcome to Building Fantasy Worlds, the panel at MICE 2022. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to thank MICE's new host and partner, Boston University, Boston University School of Visual Arts, for making this panel and the whole expo possible. This is MICE's 13th year. After 10 years hosted by Lesley University, we improvised the past two of the pandemic, and an all-virtual show in 2020 and a smaller outdoor show last year. But we are back and very large, despite the fact that we are MICE. This is our first year in our new venue, and not coincidentally, it's also the first year of BU's new graduate program in visual narrative, which is what you all have to call comics when you get a graduate degree in it. I didn't write this, but I agree. The program is run by Joel Christian Gill, a great cartoonist and longtime friend of the show. We're very thankful for Joel for being a teacher and then getting a good job and bringing us along. If a program like that sounds like something that might interest you, please check it out. MICE is produced by the Boston Comic Art Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit charitable organization that funds comic art festivals, individual artists, and educational programs for the greater Boston community. If you like what we're doing here, you can support or get involved by making a donation. Just ask at the welcome desk downstairs and in front of the gallery. And looking ahead, think about volunteering to put on the show. We need your help, oh my God. It's a lot of fun. Thank you to all volunteers. We really appreciate your work. And now, to introduce Robin, our moderator for the panel. Robin Brenner is a teen librarian at the Public Library of Brookline in Massachusetts. When not presenting programs and providing reader guidance, she has served on awards committees, including the Boston Globe Horn Book Award and the Will Eisner Comic Industry Awards. She is the editor-in-chief of the graphic novel review website No Flying, No Tights. Robin, please take a look.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm going to do a quick introduction of all of our panelists, and to give you a little bit of what we're going to do, we're going to give everyone about 5 minutes each to go through some of the artwork that we gathered and to talk about the idea of building fantasy worlds, as is the topic. And then I'll start questions, and we'll have a little bit of time at the end for audience questions as well. I'm going to go in alphabetical order here. Sarah Alfageeh is a Jordanian-American illustrator and creative director in San Francisco. She is passionate about history, teaching girls with swords, which we all are, and spaces where art and identity intersect. Her debut graphic novel, Squire, is on shelves everywhere. An upcoming picture book, Not Yet the Story of an Unlikely Skater, is in the works. Sarah is currently co-founder of One More Multiverse.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Sure. Kruttika Susarla, is an illustrator and cartoonist from Andhra Pradesh, India. She makes fiction and nonfiction comics on social, political, and literary themes. She is currently based out of St. Louis, Missouri, where she teaches part-time at Washington University in St. Louis.
Thank you.
And Jessi Zabarsky lives in Chicago with her cat and 43 plants.
More than that now.
More than that?
Like twice as much.
All right. Sounds good. She was raised in the woods and will one day return there. Her first graphic novel, Witchlight, is a comic about relationships, family, and figuring out how to be whole again. So welcome, everybody. I'm going to go through the slideshow a little bit. We've got all the things. So I should have done this as we were introducing everyone, but there you go. And it's a village called McCoy, is that correct? Yeah. And Witchlight. So you can see them all. We can talk about tables. So we'll start with you, Sarah, to talk a little bit about the images you brought. Let me know when and how to keep going.
Yeah. So as mentioned before, my name is Sarah. I am the author and illustrator behind Squire. I co-created this book alongside my co-author, Nadia. We developed the story together, and I illustrated the entirety of it, which was a mistake. So I would categorize myself more in low fantasy. I actually describe Squire as being kind of alternate history, and I intentionally built the character designs, the setting, the world, and even aspects of the plot to be intentionally recognizable by people who are from that area. It is a love letter to the tropes that I loved in fantasy, really classic hero's journey, Knights of the Round Table, but putting it in the setting where I actually read those books originally, which is spending summers in Jordan. When I was developing this book, I took a long trip. I basically hijacked the family vacation, and I went and I spent time referencing and researching in Jordan and in Istanbul. And that informs a lot of the work that I was doing here. So as I was building up Squire, and as you see kind of the reference leading up to the final design that was in the book, you can see that I'm both pulling what was functional, pulling what was actually from the region, and then adding in the elements that are going to be significant to our book. So here, as you know in comics, you are redrawing these characters over and over and over again. You kind of have to break your brain as an illustrator and accept that you can't throw your entire 100% effort into it. So you're making really conscious decisions into silhouette, into style, into how you're rendering. So every time I design a character, I have to understand I'm giving my 60% effort every time, not my 100. And my 60% has to be good enough. So here you can see where I was pulling some inspiration for this character, Husni, who's introduced in the second chapter. And right out the gate, I have a few things to communicate about him. I need to make sure that he looks spoiled, he looks rich, and he looks very distinct from the main character who I've already introduced. So I was pulling a lot of inspiration from designs that had already exist from the Ottoman Empire in Istanbul, things that I got actual reference photos myself, and also pulling from historical paintings. So this is actually how I built up the cover. And the cover was the first thing I actually drew for Squire. And I've never done that before for any other project. It was the very first sketch I even did. And because I've been trained as an illustrator, I assumed I needed to make 5 more iterations. But it was actually one and done. Here you could see the reference photos that I took myself in Jordan. This is from the ruins of Jerash. Jerash is Roman ruins. So many empires have come and gone through that region, and for anyone who's read Squire, they know that is a common theme as well. I wanted to highlight the fact that she's kind of dwarfed by her setting. I wanted to highlight that this was kind of a crumbling glory, and that's a running theme throughout the story as well. This is a page from the actual pitch that I sent to HarperCollins, Penguin Books, and many other publishers when I was originally saying, 1, what the book is, but also 2, why I thought I was the best person to create this book. So it was very important to me that they understood I was collecting this research myself, and it was coming from an informed place, not just for aesthetics. So here we have as well kind of more inspirations that I was pulling from, and now going away from the historically accurate, and now it's my job as an illustrator to make it fun and exciting. So once you know the rules, you then have to break them, or then you have to bend them for the most interesting result. So as much as I was, studying the Ottoman Empire and looking for references from the region, I was also just watching a lot of anime, and that was very important. So this was honestly like a classic combination of what would be in the tabs next to Photoshop, where I would have, anime fight compilations, what was the most interesting composition, what was the most interesting perspective. And I can't animate for this book. I have to choose the right frame at the right moment that gives me the correct impact for the story. So emotions are valued higher than historical accuracy, because we're fantasy at the end of the day. And what's cool is what's important. Again, here is an example of how I used references, how I bullied my siblings into being models for me while on vacation. Again, these are the ruins of Jerash, pulled straight from my photos and into the comics, because sometimes our actual world is just as cool as fantasy. And I pass it on.
Now we'll go to Jessi.
Hi. Let me know if I'm loud enough. So this was actually the first drawing that I did for Witchlight before I knew that it was Witchlight. This was a art test for a job that I was trying to get at the time, way back in like 2013, something like that. And I just really enjoyed this character. Thank you. It's embarrassing to see this drawing now. I am, it's so old, but the character just really stuck in my head, and I needed to know more about her. And this is just a little exercise that I did in Witchlight. Part of why I wanted to make Witchlight was because I hadn't been making a lot of comics with human characters in it, and I wanted to get better at drawing people. And I found as I went through it that there were a lot of crowd scenes, and I wanted to make sure that I wasn't phoning it in on the crowds, that like a lot of what drives my like fantasy design, aesthetic, world building stuff is thinking about the everyday people that populate the world. And so for a couple of the towns that they visit in Witchlight, I would make these like, just like draw a bunch of stock characters that it's like, okay, here's a bunch of variations on the kind of clothes that people wear in this place. Here's a bunch of different kinds of body types and faces and skin colors, and just making sure that I wasn't just copy pasting, basically. This is just a map that is in the front of Witchlight. I strongly believe that a lot of the best fantasy books have maps in the front. I read a lot of Redwall growing up. They all have maps. And it also functioned as a good reference for me, so I could track where the characters were going throughout the little world. And I tried to make this map drawing to be one of the characters has a map in the story, and this is her map, basically. And you can see little details like the blotch on the left side there is something that she blotted out, and there's like a little blue symbol slightly to the right of that, and that's something that she added in. And then there's just some pages from Witchlight highlighting different pieces of like getting that like fantasy, but you know, feeling real kind of feeling. And a lot of that I'll get from like things like food. So, you know, I don't really intentionally reference actual food. I'll just kind of like, okay, here's an idea of a food. So it's like, okay, we can kind of tell that like we've got some roots and some herbs and, you know, some other stuff going on here, but they're not like quite exactly analogous to something we would recognize. Again, like populating the world with like actual people, even if they don't have, you know, dialogue was important to me. That, you know, the named characters actually interacting with these people and like caring about them and having connections with them. And, you know, having like a detailed and, you know, like a culture that goes beyond the edges of the page for each place they visit. So you don't really see everything that's going on because the characters don't see everything that's going on there, but like, you know, this place, for instance, I know like what their soil table looks like. I know that their culture eats a lot of fish, doesn't have like a lot of root vegetables. You know, that it's there's cliffs nearby and it's fairly windy up there, so you can't. It's not like a big agricultural place. But like what you get is this little market. Again, like getting that, like, I kind of think of it as a very detailed folktale kind of feeling, where, you know, it's just like thinking about things that people use every day. What are the fabrics? What are the containers? What are the chairs? You know, thinking about, okay, don't just draw a chair, draw the chair that this person has. Again, the houses all look different in each place that the characters visit. And it's like, okay, what materials do they have there? What is growing there? What is the climate like? You know, does it rain a lot? This is from my second book, Coming Back. And this one, there's a lot of focus on specific like cultural practices of this like very isolated community. And so like this is a funeral. And even like a funeral has this this fantasy element to it. And this is the continuation of the funeral, and basically through this procession, we're seeing more of the town, how the buildings look, how the people look, what the fashion looks like, and as they go through the town, the procession builds and builds. And this is inside two of the characters' homes, and again, like getting that like what do people use? What is their everyday life like? And, what are things that they maybe have made themselves, like that rug on the floor? Again, food and cooking utensils, and what do they clean with? All this like kind of grungy everyday stuff is very interesting to me. Again, cultural practice stuff and crowd scenes. There's, as much as I focused on crowd scenes in Witchlight, I doubled it in coming back and then regretted it. But, it was, again, important to me to try to draw a lot of different faces and fashions and body types and all that stuff. One, because it's just realistic and it does make the world feel grounded. And two, because I get bored. But like the cultural part of this on the right side is, like not strictly explained, but like, that this is something that all of these people are, they know what they're doing. And even if the reader doesn't know exactly what, it feels, like a textured world because that kind of cultural practice is going on. This, again, like having stuff that, like these weird creatures on the far page, like those are just like, that's a thing that shows up. This character is asleep for it. She doesn't even know it's happening, and then they never come back because the world is bigger than what she's experiencing. It's bigger than what we're experiencing. And another little small cultural thing, there's several times in the book where this character has little songs that she's been singing, and it's something that connects her back to her family and her community and, keeps her spirits up. This is these characters going to a new place, which is very frightening for one of them and very exciting for the other. And it's a place that's very different from where they're from, and there's just like all of these different kinds of people. A lot of them aren't anthropomorphic even. And I just wanted to expand as much as possible what a person could look like.
Hi, I'm Kruttika, and these are some initial sketches for my newest comic, A Village Called McCoy's. The premise is it's set in this village where a firestorm happens and kind of destroys the ecosystem of the planet, and like these different communities in the village who don't get along with each other have to figure out ways to work with each other. So when I started working on the comic, I kind of didn't think of this as fantasy. So I'm bad with writing. I think in pictures. So this was me trying to figure out what the characters in this universe would look like, what the world could kind of look like. I knew I wanted to kind of do a story around a wasteland or like a post-apocalyptic kind of story, but also hopeful, not all doom and gloom. So this was me trying to figure some of those details out, but also have fun with it. Like one idea that I kind of didn't end up taking forward was to do these trees that were made of people, so not leaves. That's in the bottom left here. What's in the next? And then once I found like a character, so I knew I wanted to do like a, so I think for the longest time with the story, I tried to do a hero's journey kind of thing. So there would be the central character with a pigeon as their friend who was kind of going through this wasteland and talking to different people in the world and kind of like bringing them together to work on this issue. But it kept falling apart. And so then I kind of started exploring the other people in this world. So as you can see, I made notes about like how do I give contrast between like the good characters and the bad characters. And I realized that the reason I was failing was because none of these people were bad, but they kind of were approaching the problem from their social positions, I guess. So they couldn't see the bigger picture, and so they needed to come together. And that's kind of the direction I ended up going with. So there's no like one main character in the story. And similar to Jessi, I ended up doing a map because that helped me figure out where each of these communities were living in the village and what kind of advantage they had because of where they were living. So, well, I didn't put this in text, but the coding that was in the story was that the people who were living on the hill were kind of probably like elite society or like higher class, and the people who were kind of so there's like a sickness in the story, and that's kind of in the valley or like in this river kind of zone. And so the people who were there were more like working class, kind of more in touch with the problem that they were facing. This was me. So I think this was like the first not map or 2D sketch I was making of the world. Kind of what would it look like if a character was walking through this landscape? And as I was doing that, I was also trying to allocate, how much time are we spending in each part of the village, and then how is it all going to come together in the end? Kind of in the same way that all of these characters are isolated and they also come together in the end. So I also kind of, that's fine, you can. So this is again like, I guess, a 3D version of the map. So as you can see, like in the very first sketch, I tried making like a literal bridge that would kind of get burnt down. But then I realized that I actually didn't need that. I just needed to show like one landscape, which kind of, so like I said, the people on the hill were kind of not getting affected by the sickness, but within the same land, the more you kind of go down in the landscape, it gets worse. And then, yeah, this is just like a part of the process, tighter pencils. And then, so I knew that I wanted the line art to kind of do all of the visual weightlifting. I used watercolor pencils and dry brushing for this. And every chapter just has like one key color. So that way you also know which part of the village you were in. So stuff that's happening like kind of closer to the valley is green and blue. And when you go up to the hill, it's purple. And then I used yellow through all the chapters to kind of denote the problem or the sickness that all of these villagers were kind of dealing with, which should be in the... Yeah, and this is like, I guess, some of my process sketches. Again, because I did not write a script or like figure out the story like that, I started drawing pictures, kind of walking through this made-up world and figuring out what the characters might be doing. When I needed to change parts of the story, I would just like post it or stick pages on top of it and then refine it, as you can see on the page on the right. Yeah, just like more kind of figuring out the colors for some of these sketches, which then in the next page, this is what like the final version of the story looked like. So towards like, I guess, when you reach the conflict point, this is where like everyone in the story realizes that, okay, like this is not like someone else's problem. The sickness has kind of enveloped all of us, and so I kind of wanted to convey that visually. So it's kind of like very flat, but it's also enveloping all the characters, I guess. So this spread is kind of doing that, while they're also at the same time arguing about who caused the problem. Yeah, and then the next page is like, so there's this like fisherwomen community who are also like kind of seeing this sickness, and then people from other parts of the village kind of come to them to see if, basically everyone's trying to blame each other in the story, and you get like different points of interaction through this like yellow substance or the sickness. Yeah, and this is like towards the end of the story, where you, with the colors, you see all of these characters kind of going out of their comfort zones and like physical boundaries and talking and working with each other and kind of tackling the problem, which then becomes fainter. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for walking us through all the images. That was lovely. But so some of this was already brought up, but one thing I was thinking about was kind of a dual question of, are there fantasy stories that you were inspired by either when you were younger or now in terms of what you wanted to tell? And were there stories that you were kind of, I don't want to say reacting against, but were basically saying, you know, I want to not do that. I want to do something that I would rather see on the page. I don't know who wants to jump in first.
Yeah, Squire, as I mentioned, was really inspired by that like classical hero's journey. But of course, like as I was reading these books growing up, I never saw these stories told with settings and cultures and characters that, you know, sounded like me, looked like me, you know, dressed like me, that kind of thing. And so I knew very consciously that I didn't want to compromise the things that I loved. And it's a very, very self-indulgent book for that reason. And even in the art style as well, I was pulling from manga and anime and kind of Eastern traditions rather than Western tradition for comics. And I just, again, it was that thing of like, I don't have to compromise what I enjoy. And Squire is very much like a culmination of me and Nadia's deep passions for the stories and the art that we loved. We knew that when we were representing women, when we were representing men, there were certain stereotypes, both visually and narratively, that we wanted to very consciously sidestep. So, for example, the men in Squire are not the like gruff. Well, they are gruff, but they're not the, what's the word, domineering and scary figures that you would assume in a lot of Middle Eastern settings. So not to say that those characters can't exist, but we just recognize that this wasn't a trope that was necessary or particularly interesting for the story that we were trying to tell. Similarly, when we had Isa's parents being introduced in the first chapter, as she's choosing to set off into the world, we didn't feel like it was necessary for her to rebel against her parents. Because while that is a very common setting, very common trope in fantasy, it was a negative stereotype for like an Arab character. And while this is still, you know, supposed to be a fantastical setting, these were the choices that we felt were necessary to make in order to present something new and refreshing and hopefully more exciting for readers.
For me, I grew up really loving a lot of like fantasy YA, like novels, you know, Tamora Pierce and Diana Wynne Jones and, you know, the Earthsea Cycle, and also really loving a lot of manga. You know, one of my favorite ever is the Nausicaa manga, which I have very strong feelings about that versus the movie. But I, especially at the time that I was first making Witchlight, I wasn't really seeing those kinds of stories, and especially with female leads and queer themes in comics. And I was like, this is my medium, this is what I love. I love so much of what comics does, but it's not telling the stories that I want to read. And so I had to make it, I guess. And I think we're entering a great time for fantasy comics now, and I'm very excited that there's so much more.
Some of my influences are more recent. For this comic, I think I was kind of very subconsciously influenced by Hilda, by Luke Pearson, which I love. I think that story, like both the comic and the series, do a good job of kind of building up this non-hero. Like Hilda is a central character, but like when she moves out and when she moves from the wilderness into the city, she's kind of alone and she's very disengaged with her setting. But she only like starts connecting with the city when she makes friends and she's kind of bothered about bad stuff happening in her neighborhood, I guess. Similarly, there's a new comic by two of my favorite Indian authors, Rajiv Ipe and C.G. Salamander. They're doing a comic book series called Maithili and the Minotaur. It's about this kid who's friends with a monster, but like her mother is like probably a witch, and other kids don't like her. So then she has to kind of become friends with the monsters in the school and kind of figure out her way around it. So I feel like some of these things informed my comic as well. Just like the idea of one person not fixing stuff that was happening in the world.
Yeah, I think one of the other things that's come up a little bit with the discussion of food is also the idea of how do you ground fantasy into the real world, or to make it feel real and like a real place you might go. So I wonder, I was thinking things like food, sound, clothing, architecture, like all the things that can really make it feel like a real place. And especially in comics, you get to see it. You're not imagining it in your own head. So I just wondered if you had any specifics that you really, either you rely on just for your own sense of a place or of a people, or if there's just things you really loved about what you could pull in for these works.
I really related to what you were talking about, like designing a chair, designing these like details of the world that, a reader is going to just glaze their eyes over. They're only spending, 20 seconds on a page, to be honest, and we're laboring over a page for hours at a time. And I highly relate to that. Like, for example, when I have dinner scenes, it wasn't a moment I had to dwell on. It was just, a necessary place for characters to come together and talk. I had them all sitting in a circle on the floor because that's how I have dinner with my family. And anyone who comes from a background like that, they're going to connect to that detail. And anyone who doesn't come from that background, it still functions as a necessary scene. It doesn't distract too much. And I loved leaving like a breadcrumb trail of details for people who would notice.
Yeah, I very much, especially beginning with Witchlight, the first chapter or so, you may notice that like the buildings are not super well designed or drawn. There's not a lot of background detail because I was, I very much had the stereotype or something, the block in my head of like, oh, backgrounds are hard, backgrounds are boring. And eventually I figured out like the effort that I have to put in is not to draw something really realistically. It's to draw it in a way that I feel connection to that object. That it's like, oh, that's an object that I would like to have in my home.
Designing because you're bored, which is what you mentioned with the crowd scene, fuels me.
Yep.
Like I none of my extras, like background characters, are drawn in similar style. Even though I have like a uniform in my book that, hundreds of characters have to wear, they're all a little bit different because I just got bored.
Yeah.
That's pretty functional.
But like that makes it, each of those people are individuals and they each are going to wear their uniform a little bit differently.
Exactly
They're going
so.
to stand a
Yeah.
little bit differently. They're going to have different facial expressions.
Yeah.
Like, it
You
makes
actually
sense.
don't want like that much consistency
No.
in comics.
Sarah, I guess I had a question for you. Because you've done so much historical research for like a fantasy comic, and I haven't read your comic yet, but do you mention names of real places in your comic, or is it more like people who are from there kind of know where this is?
So, for example, I have Petra, like the, world wonder, literally in that comic. And that was done quite intentionally because how many times are we going to watch, a fantasy movie, Game of Thrones, something, and you're like, that's just Spain. Like, we know what that is, And I was like, bro, I want that. Like, why not? Who's going to stop me? And so I wanted to put in places that people would recognize, that it's not uncommon for fantasy. And so while the nationalities, the geography, the configuration of tribes and these different political factions as well, I knew that they were going to be made up, but they were grounded in something real. And I wanted it to be recognizable. I wanted people to be able to see this part of their cultural background. And because if you've ever gone to Petra, it is fantastical. You can't believe your eyes, and it's just so dominant. And you want to add a story to it. And so I did.
Yeah.
And that was a common phrase me and my co-author threw at each other. It's like, call the comics police. Tell them I did it.
That's being very self-indulgent when writing and designing is definitely something I relate to. That I made Witchlight for me. I made Coming Back for me, and then other people liked it, and I'm very thankful. But
Do you have any things that you know are true about the world that you wished you could include that you didn't get to?
I know a lot about just like farming practices. I love gardening and growing vegetables and nonsense like that. And so I'm just like, okay, so what's the soil composition in every place? And like,
I think every fantasy author has like the 3 hours of conversation or of planning just so that a character can say one single line that nobody's gonna notice. It doesn't matter, you know now. You know the geography of a mountain range.
yeah,
So.
it's like, okay, what kind of grains do they have here?
Yeah, the amount of story and world building you have to do versus like what ends up on the page, and you actually do need to know it because you're getting to know this world so you can start picking out the interesting details. Because the amount of notes we have as authors is not interesting.
Yeah. I mean, similarly, like in my comic, this is not like a real world detail, but like within the world of the comic, I guess there's this one scientist kind of character, and she has like a lot of bookish knowledge, and in an earlier version of the story, the reason for that was that she had access to like this one last library in the world, but then that was kind of its own comic. And my classmates were like, this has to be 3 different books if you want to include the part about the library kind of being the last one as well.
Yeah, a lot of my characters, they're engaging with, like, they're referencing and engaging with stories that were told to them over their lifetime. But the thing is that I'm not here to tell them about, like, fake mythology to the reader. I'm here to tell them the story about these characters. So I just have to, like, what's more important in those moments isn't the mythology of the world, but how the characters themselves are reacting to it and using it to interact with each other and progress the story forward. Yeah.
So in that sense, actually, I wonder about the idea of fantasy, especially anything speculative, is often used as a way to explore either emotions or themes or characters that obviously resonate in the real world, that are things that we all recognize, as we've already been talking about, but the kind of like conflicts, obviously colonialism, like all of these things that can come through, but give people a way to look at it from another perspective, from either a mirror or a different kind of fracture in how they see it, which maybe makes it sink in a little more. So I'm just wondering if you feel like there's a way for fantasy to tell those stories, either, I don't know if I'd say better, but in a more emotional way, or and how you think about that when you're creating the fantasy.
I guess my co-author and I, we often talk about how we needed fantasy to tell like a true story about ourselves, because so many of the themes and the elements like that was our experience growing up. So to give a quick gist of Squire, it's a girl born kind of on in an area that's been absorbed by a larger country and empire, and she joins the army to then become a knight and hopefully get citizenship and a better path forward. This is not an uncommon story for immigrant kids, especially if you're growing up Arab American like myself in the early 2000s. Military recruitment was really legit. I saw a lot of friends get offers. Saw a lot of family get offers. Be a translator, prove you're, a good citizen. Tell us what's happening in that mosque of yours. So surveillance and this effort to prove yourself that you're like everybody else was very present. And when I was coming up with Squire at the time, I was a high school and middle school art teacher. And so as I'm thinking about the kind of stories I want to write and the kind of stuff I'm doing, I'm listening to my kids talk about climate change, talk about the Parkland shooting. So I'm watching 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds get on CNN and talk about how adults are failing them. And I felt like a lot of the YA novels and books that I was seeing were talking down to kids. And I'm like, they're more on top of it, and they have opinions, and they have the optimism to find solutions for these large-scale problems that, the adults I'm seeing on Twitter are kind of just, they want to ignore, they want to run away from. And I knew immediately that any book that I wrote, would center kind of that really important young stage where it's like they're excited to see themselves They're excited to step forward and be a change in a place where otherwise adults have kind of given up on the problem.
For me, both of my books very much like, I don't know, there's big themes of anxiety. That's something that I've dealt with for a long time, and like something that I think is very helpful, having a fantastical setting and characters who have like magical abilities, is just like letting your emotions be bigger than your body, which is something that I've felt a lot. And, you know, like I like a lot of manga and anime, and like these like big dramatic emotions, you know, even like the very classic, like, you know, rose backgrounds around a character, where it's like, this is something that is completely imaginary, but it's so visual.
Like a gasp deserves a whole page. I love that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that like just drawing emotions the way that they feel, which is not necessarily how they look. Yeah, that like the metaphorical parts of the world really help me put onto paper what the characters are feeling.
I mean, I think Sarah kind of touched on a lot of the things that I was trying to do with this comic. So before this comic, I've mostly done like nonfiction, political, editorial kind of cartoons. And I feel like fiction and fantasy is a good way of doing the same things without being so didactic, without telling people, this is bad and this is good, and like, don't do this. And I feel like making a made-up world kind of gave me the space to do that. So like within my story, there's this, I mean, essentially like, it's kind of what's happening right now. Like with climate change, we have like all of these climate change labs that like Ivy League universities are setting up. Like design is going to solve like our climate crisis. And that's kind of like what's happening in the story as well. These like people who kind of have a lot of tech and expertise trying to find solutions, but like they just make the problem worse. And in the end, like everyone in the story kind of realizes that they have to just stop doing the thing that they're doing, and that's kind of a part of the solution, which I feel like a lot of activists who are able to tie like climate change to colonialism or the class struggle are kind of saying the same things. Yeah, and that was like a way for me to explore this.
And one thing I think fascinates me as a librarian, you know, I try very hard not to tell people what to read in any way and help them find what they're looking for. But I also run into resistance when it's fantasy, either fantasy or science fiction. I've definitely had, as soon as I mention, oh, it's a fantasy about something, people just be like, oh, well, I don't want to read that. And it's very frustrating. So I just wonder if you've ever run into that kind of resistance and how you might kind of pitch your stories to combat that kind of attitude that they only want something that's realistic.
I think for me personally, I don't usually talk about my stuff as fantasy, I think. Just thinking about how I've described my comics down on the show floor, it's like, I talk more about like that, there's big feelings and eating good food together and sword fights and magic battles and, centering girls and queer characters, and all that adds up to a fantasy story. But I think people like a lot of things about fantasy stories and don't realize it. So personally, I haven't experienced too much resistance, but maybe they're just not telling me.
You're describing just my dad. Bless him. But you know what? He did love Squire. So I would have to say, like, his main resistance to fantasy, and I think a lot of people's resistance to fantasy and sci-fi is like, well, I just want a real story. I want a real story. And I'm like, you think Ocean's 11 is a real story? Like, come on now. And I think it's that suspension of disbelief is really difficult. They can't seem to get past that. It's very distracting to them. And so I really appreciate the way that you pitch your books, where it's like you hone in on the elements you can kind of find in any story, right? Like fantasy is just kind of our vehicle to talk about these stories that are, have universal themes and have universal feelings. And the whole point is that you're thrown into a situation to ask yourself, what would I do? And if it's easier to do that if a character is on a train versus on a dragon, like that's fine. But I will always nudge someone to try something new. When I worked at a library, I just told people to read. I wasn't as kind as you.
Personally, I haven't seen or faced any resistance towards fantasy, but I think there's a thing in India where a lot of fantasy is rooted in mythology, and so it directly or indirectly takes from religion. And I think me and a lot of people in my generation are now trying to do fantasy minus religion. Like, you need to be able to empathize with other people who are not from the same religious background or caste or race or what. And I think there are lots of people doing great work in that space, and I see this kind of being or sharing the same kind of space. And hopefully work like that will also become mainstream at some point in the way that mythology is mainstream, I guess. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to open it up, so if anyone has a question, I have more that I can ask, but I can't, sorry, I can't see the shirt you're wearing, but yes, the glasses.
Nice and loud.
In the end of the story, in the end, the world's about serving the story. So how do you find an endpoint to your world building so you can actually get onto the page, as opposed to, finding out what the methods of the dictator who failed 150 years ago were, as opposed to, your actual characters who exist?
So just to summarize it, so I feel like I understand your question, when do you stop world building and when do you start writing?
Yeah.
Okay. How do you connect those two pieces? I think if you, because at the end of the day, the reason you're world building is because your character or the stuff they're interacting with have to say something, or you have to show something on the page. If you can't I guess it's trying to keep it, purpose driven. Right? I need them to meet another character and tell them where they're from so they can start talking as friends. Because that's what you do when you meet someone new, is you say, hi, my name's this, and I'm from here. What does that look like in a world that, you don't say, I'm from Georgia, I'm from Boston, right? So it's remembering that necessary human connection and then applying your own fun details to it. So it was always very, mission driven. Or at least that's how it felt for me.
For me, I think the two kind of happen at the same time, that I will often start with, like I showed for Witchlight, that, just one image or a short scene in my head of this encapsulates the kind of the tone. I don't know the whole story yet, but I know kind of this is what I want it to feel like. And that will get me thinking about okay, I have this vague scene in my head. What do the trees look like? What do the houses look like? And then from there, that will get me into more scene writing, and then it'll bounce just back and forth, and just asking myself questions about both of those kinds of things, kind of just interlaces the world and the story.
Yeah, I think similarly for me, world building and story writing happen simultaneously, also because I'm thinking in pictures. But I guess my process was very dependent on having other people read it and be like, does this make sense to you? Does this feel like a coherent story? And sometimes people would tell me that these are 3 different stories and you need to just pick one and go with it. And that's also helpful.
Yeah, having the ideas exist outside your own sketchbook, outside your own brain was really helpful. Like me and Nadia, we co-created Squire, but she's the one who like refined it into something actually readable. Because if it was up to me, it would be like 50 facts about a culture you don't care about, and then like 9 jokes, and that would be the book.
Okay.
Cool.
I saw some more hands going up. So yeah, with the pink hair.
Nice and loud.
I was just wondering, since you guys are writing about a culture that you guys are from, were you ever like afraid that you were kind of like stereotyping yourself in a way, or like were you ever scared of how somebody else would perceive your writing? Because I know, as a person of color from a background, I'm always afraid of like, well, what if I depict this in a certain way, and then they see that like maybe I'm like acting into some kind of stereotype. I wouldn't want someone to perceive my culture that way. Is that something that you guys are worried about, or like dance around at all?
Bro, we have 10 minutes. Dang. Okay. Let's speed run this. Yeah, I think it's always top of mind. I mean, I am drawing, pun, from a culture that I am from. But at the same time, like, I'm not living in the Middle East. And so for me, when I tell people, like, what Squire is about, I have to reiterate, I'm like, this is actually, like, a super American story. This is about being an American immigrant kid. And a lot of people get distracted by the fact that they see Petra and they see the Middle East and all this other stuff. And there's the whole point, the whole problem with stereotyping is that you have one story to reference, and so everything outside of that, like, people struggle to realize, you know, you get flattened out if you're from a marginalized community or culture. And so we need contradicting stories. We need stories that are not gonna reflect that, like, initial dominant narrative, right? And kind of do this consciously. And I don't know, maybe this is a controversial opinion, but I'm always a fan of more stories rather than less stories. Like, just you get it out and figure it out, and we'll go from there.
I mean, for me, like, I don't have a lot of cultural tropes in my comic, I guess, but you kind of do get the idea that the story is maybe loosely set in India. And a way of kind of avoiding tropes, but also doing that for me was to imagine my reader to be someone from India in India right now. And like, I wouldn't go, I probably wouldn't like label names of places or like write down names of trees or like use certain words because people get it. And if someone else is reading it, I mean, it's okay. They can put an extra effort into learning about these things. I guess that's like my way of avoiding stereotyping yourself.
Mm-hmm. Like, one of my main beef with Star Wars and like Iron Man and a lot of these fantastical worlds is that, like, you could so clearly tell when you as the reader were never intended to be part of the audience. Yeah. Like, for example, I think it was like Iron Man 1, he's in Afghanistan or something like that, and the dude speaks Arabic, which they don't speak in that country, you know? And I'm like, you could have given 2 seconds to check, Google it, you know? Or don't, I guess, right? Like, screw me. And then in Star Wars, they straight up like speak Swahili as one of the alien languages. And I'm like, my guy, come on now. So it's really interesting to see like where you stop putting effort. And the moment you stop putting effort, that's where you get your lazy writing. That's where you get your lazy tropes. And someone out there is gonna hate you for it. But that's just the truth. You know, someone out there is mad at me.
I think
I'm white, so it doesn't really apply to me, but it is.
But it does apply.
I mean, the sort of thing I can think of is that in which light Sanja is kind of white. I think I don't have like, you know, quite real world races, but I do try to, you know, have her be the one that's like a little more sheltered and a little more like basing her opinions off of stereotypes and like just like being looking that in the face of like, this is a thing that I know is inside of me and that I have to be conscious of, and this is something that she also has to learn to be conscious of.
Okay, I think we have time for at least one more. Why don't you go ahead?
Hi.
So, you mentioned a lot about world building, but how do you do the story building? Like, how do you actually write a story? Because that's.
I'm sure there's a
something I
panel
feel
for
like
that.
It seems a little bit easier, but.
Depends on what's the fun part for you, right?
Yeah, writing is definitely the fun part for me. I grew up very much like having writing and storytelling as like, oh, this is playing. Like, so like for Witchlight, for example, I was doing it chapter by chapter at the time. And, each chapter was drawn in like a month or two, but the writing part for each chapter was like a night. So, but like process-wise, I just keep a notes file on my phone and just like dump anything I find interesting into there that is like, shower thoughts and walking around my neighborhood thoughts and like, oh, I like this plant, or this is an interesting thing in this other book. And eventually, like, themes start to build out of those because, like, I like what I like. When it comes time to actually write it out, there's enough there that, repetitions have formed and there's, actual scenes in there, and I can kind of just like mush the bread dough into a loaf.
Man, you don't script, right?
I don't. Yeah. So
That's terrifying.
I'm jealous of Jessi. I wish I could just like sit
Y'all write
overnight
and
write.
draw, and you're cute. Damn.
I mean, for me, like, so the very first, like, the random images that you've seen, I'll draw, like, an image that I think is fun for me, and then try and imagine, like, a before and after, and that's usually something sequential. And then I do, like, gags on the side, and then sometimes a friend will be like, you can't make a whole comic with just gags. There has to be, like, story in between.
Watch me. But that's actually, like, why I needed a co-author. Yeah, it's self-indulgent half the time. Someone's going to have to beat you into hitting a deadline at some point. Yeah. You got room for one more?
I think we can do a quick one. Let's see.
Got to be quick. No existential questions.
How about Stevie?
How would you go through avoiding a world of hats when it comes to culture and character design?
Sorry, a world of what?
A world of hats where the plains people live in the plains, the centaur people are the centaurs. Basic characteristics for your characters and their culture.
It all comes down to the specifics, right? The same way that you don't want to stereotype an existing culture, you consider like, well, how do I make sure that this fake culture that I'm building up is also just as richly diverse? Like people from the same group are going to disagree with each other. They're going to have economic differences maybe. They're going to have different roles in their society. And so it actually helps a lot to like look at existing structures and pull your inspiration from there. You don't need to make it up from scratch. In fact, you probably shouldn't, because it's already hard enough to like understand all the different elements you're throwing and introducing a character to. It helps to have like, some structure to a society that is recognizable. They have a leader or a council. They have, people who have lower class jobs and upper class jobs. And you start breaking it down from there. Like, listen, I got beef with Tolkien. I got beef with Lord of the Rings. Like, yeah, they're an orc society. They're all fighters. Yeah, sure. I was like, who makes their food? What are they up to? Who makes their clothes? Someone's doing it, right? No? Okay.
Very much all of that. I think just thinking about it, what comes to mind is like thinking about the map that was up there. And if you think about a map that doesn't have like state borders or country borders drawn on it, that map that I had, like, it had trees marked, it had rivers marked. There weren't defined borders between this people lives here and this people lives here. And I think that's a really helpful visual to keep in mind because it helps you know that the people aren't like this, they're like this. And there's, language and fashion and food and all of this stuff that's going to overlap between groups of people. And there's going to be some overarching things, depending on like what's available in the place or like what's popular. But there's always going to be, diffusion and bleed. And, especially when you have stories where the main characters are traveling, it's good to remember that they're not the only ones traveling. A lot of other people are traveling and bringing ideas and goods and stories and all of this stuff to other people. And they're going to mix and change and adopt and, just be diverse and wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, with my comic as well, there's like the practical stuff, like the fisherwomen live closer to the coast because it's just easy to do your job there. But also there's like the main story itself. Like people didn't just decide to live in these isolated things. Like, for example, like with the guy in the first chapter, like the pigeon person, their whole community was kind of driven out, and so you kind of see semblances of that in the story. So that they don't just exist in that part of the world, and they kind of crop up in other parts of the world and stuff. Yeah.
The fun part about world building as well is when you make up a rule for your world, it's also fun to break that made up rule.
Yeah.
Because that's how people work too. No one's just like following in orderly lines as well.
Yeah.
Like, and that's where some of the most fun comes out of as well, is to contradict yourself on purpose.
Okay, I think we are at the end, but thank you all for speaking so eloquently about this, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for Building Fantasy Worlds. Thank you so much to Robin and our panelists for conducting a wonderful program. I'm sure I was definitely here for all of it. And if you want to find our panelists, you can see their tables here on the screen. Please write them down. You'll also find them in your program. And thank you so much. We hope to join you for the rest of the afternoon and also tomorrow from 11 to 5. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of MICE.